This is Stephen Aldridge, and you're listening to an excerpt from Chapter 3 of American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Setting aside his qualms, Ferguson eventually agreed to visit Cambridge early that spring. He put me in a room next door, and I remember thinking that I'd better make sure that he didn't turn up in the night, so I put a chair up against the door. But nothing happened. By then, Robert seemed to be on the mend. When Ferguson briefly raised the matter, he said that he needn't worry, that he was over that. Indeed, Robert had been seeing yet another psychoanalyst, his third, within 4 months, in Cambridge. By this time, Robert had read a good deal about psychoanalysis, and according to his friend John Edsall, he took it very seriously. He also thought that his new analyst, a Dr. M., was a wiser and more sensible man than either of the doctors he had consulted in London and Paris. Robert apparently continued to see this analyst throughout the spring of 1926, but over time their relationship broke down. One day in June, Robert dropped by John Edsall's lodgings and told him that Dr. M has decided that there's no use in going on with the analysis any further. Herbert Smith later ran into one of his psychiatrist friends in New York who knew of the case, and claimed that Robert gave the psychiatrist in Cambridge an outrageous song and dance. The trouble is, you've got to have a psychiatrist who is abler than the person who's being analyzed. They don't have anybody. In mid-March 1926, Robert left Cambridge on a short vacation. 3 friends, Jeffrey Wyman, Frederick Bernheim, and John Edsall, had talked him into accompanying them to Corsica. For 10 days they bicycled the length of the island, sleeping in small village inns or camping out in the open. The island's craggy mountains and lightly forested high mesas may well have reminded Robert of New Mexico's rugged beauty. The scenery was magnificent, recalled Bernheim. Verbal communication with the natives disastrous, and the local fleas abundantly fed each night. Robert's dark moods occasionally overcame him, and he sometimes spoke of feeling depressed. He had been reading a great deal of French and Russian literature in recent months, and as they hiked through the mountains, he enjoyed arguing with Edsall over the relative merits of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. One evening after being drenched by a sudden thunderstorm, the young men sought shelter in a nearby inn. As they hung their wet clothes by a fire and huddled in blankets, Edsall insisted, "Tolstoy is the writer I most enjoy." No, Dostoevsky is superior," Oppenheimer said. "He gets to the soul and torment of man." Later, when the conversation turned to their respective futures, Robert remarked, "The kind of person that I admire most would be one who becomes extraordinarily good at doing a lot of things, but still maintains a tear-stained countenance." If Robert seemed burdened by such intensely existential thoughts, his companions nevertheless got a strong impression that he was unburdening himself as they hiked around the island. Clearly relishing the dramatic scenery, the good French food and wines, he wrote his brother Frank, "It's a great place, with every virtue from wine to glaciers, from langoust to brigantines." In Corsica, Wyman believed, Robert was passing through a great emotional crisis, and then something strange happened. One day, Wyman recalled, decades later, when we'd almost finished our time in Corsica, we were staying in some little inn, the 3 of us, Edsall, Oppenheimer, and I, and we were having dinner together. The waiter approached Oppenheimer and told him when the next boat departed for France. Surprised, Edsall and Wyman asked Oppenheimer why he was rushing back earlier than planned. "I can't bear to speak of it," Robert replied, "but I've got to go." Later in the evening, after they had drunk a little more wine, he relented and said, "Well, perhaps I can tell you why I have to go. I've done a terrible thing. I've put a poisoned apple on Blackett's desk, and I've got to go back and see what happened." Edsall and Wyman were stunned. "I never knew," Wyman recalled, "whether it was real or imaginary." Robert didn't elaborate, but he did mention that he had been diagnosed with dementia praecox. Unaware that the poisoned apple incident had actually occurred the previous autumn, Wyman and Edsall assumed that Robert, in a fit of jealousy, had done something to Blackett that spring just before their trip to Corsica. Clearly something had happened, but, as Edsall put it later, he, Robert, spoke of it with a sense of reality that Jeffries and I both felt that this must be some kind of hallucination on his part. Over the decades, the truth of the poisoned apple story has been muddied by conflicting accounts. In his 1979 interview with Martin Sherwin, however, Ferguson made it quite plain that the incident occurred in the late autumn of 1925 and not in the spring of 1926. All this happened during his first term at Cambridge, and just before I met him in London, when he was going to the psychiatrist. When Sherwin asked if he really believed the poisoned apple story, Ferguson replied, "Yes, I do. I do." His father then had to engineer the authorities of Cambridge about Robert's attempted murder. Talking with Alice Kimball Smith in 1976, Ferguson referred to the time when he tried to poison one of his people. He told me about it at the time or shortly thereafter in Paris. I always assumed that it was probably true, but I don't know. He was doing all sorts of crazy things then. Ferguson certainly appeared to Smith to be a reliable source. As she noted after interviewing him, he doesn't pretend to remember anything he doesn't. Oppenheimer's prolonged adolescence was finally coming to an end. Sometime during his short stay in Corsica, something happened to him in the nature of an awakening. Whatever it was, Oppenheimer made sure that it remained a carefully cultivated mystery. Perhaps it was a fleeting love affair, but more likely not. Years later, he would respond to a query from the author Noel Farr Davis. "The psychiatrist was a prelude to what began for me in Corsica. You ask whether I will tell you the full story, or whether you must dig it out. But it is known to few, and they won't tell. You can't dig it out. What you need to know is that it was not a mere love affair, not a love affair at all, but love." The encounter held some kind of mystical, transcendental meaning for Oppenheimer. Geography was henceforth the only separation I recognized, but for me it was not a real separation. It was, he told Davis, a great thing in my life, a great and lasting part of it, more to me now, even more as I look back when my life is nearly over. So what actually happened in Corsica? Probably nothing. Oppenheimer deliberately answered Davis's query about Corsica with an enigma sure to frustrate his biographers. He coyly called it love, and not a mere love affair. Obviously, the distinction was important to him. In the company of his friends, he had no opportunity for a real affair, but he did read a book that appears to have resulted in an epiphany. The book was Marcel Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu, a mystical and existential text that spoke to Oppenheimer's troubled soul. Reading it in the evening by flashlight during his walking tour of Corsica, he later claimed to his Berkeley friend Haakon Chevalier was one of the great experiences of his life. It snapped him out of his depression. Proust's work is a classic novel of introspection, and it left a deep and lasting impression on Oppenheimer. More than a decade after he first read Proust, Oppenheimer startled Chevalier by quoting from memory a passage in Volume 1 that discusses cruelty. Perhaps she would not have considered evil to be so rare, so extraordinary, so estranging a state to which it was so restful to emigrate, had she been able to discern in herself, as in everyone, that indifference to the sufferings one causes, an indifference which, whatever other names one may give it, is the terrible and permanent form of cruelty. As a young man in Corsica, Robert no doubt memorized these words precisely because he saw in himself an indifference to the sufferings he caused others. It was a painful insight. One can only speculate about a man's inner life, but perhaps seeing an expression of his own dark and guilt-laden thoughts in print somehow lightened Robert's psychological burden. It had to be comforting to know that he was not alone, that this was part of the human condition. He no longer need despise himself. He could love. And perhaps it was also reassuring, particularly for an intellectual, that Robert could tell himself that it was a book, and not a psychiatrist, which had helped to wrench him from the black hole of his depression. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for more. This is Stephen Aldridge. Until next time, keep reading.